Second hour of our program. On the line with us is our old friend Bishop William J. Barber II. He's the pastor of Greenleaf Christian Church, Disciples of Christ in Goldsboro, North Carolina. He's the president and senior lecturer at Repairers of the Breach, and he's the architect of the Forward Together Moral Movement. The website breachrepairers.org. You can tweet him at Revdr Barber or at B Repairers. Dr. Barber, welcome back to the program, and thanks so much for joining us. First of all, did I get the website correct in my introduction here?
Yes, it's www.breachrepairers.org, or now, you know, with me being co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, people can also go to www.poorpeoplescampaign.org. And Tom, it's good to be back on your show.
Well, thank you. It's always nice talking with you. You've got this mobilization tour that, if I have my details right, kicked off just a couple days ago on Valentine's Day, and is going to culminate in D.C. on June 18th. Do I have that right? And give us the details.
You got it right. We kicked it off on Love Day, on Valentine's Day, in Alabama, Georgia, and Florida, and Mississippi. You know, 1/3 of all poor people live in the South, poor low-wealth people. 1/3 of all poor low-wealth white people live in the South. And we have in this country 140 million poor low-wealth people before COVID. Now, think about that. 50% of the nation, 50 children, 41 million people are living where they live with our minimum wage. For 2018 tips. Of the day for a moral reset in this country. And it's for a third restoration. The mass poor people's low-wage workers assembly moral march on Washington and to the polls June 18th in Washington, D.C. For this moral reset, to give the stage to poor people from Appalachia to Alabama, from California to the Carolinas, along with religious leaders and economists and lawyers who are going to say, you know, we're tired of the lives of scarcity. We're tired of the lies that we don't know how to do this. We can end poverty from the bottom up if we would engage the third Reconstruction agenda.
Can you speak to the first two Reconstructions and why a third Reconstruction is necessary and what it's made of, what the details?
Black and all over the South, white slaves and free to open up voting. They changed labor laws. They changed criminal justice laws. They changed the Constitution, put into support protection under the 15th Amendment. Nobody can deny or abridge the right to vote. Now, that Reconstruction was put down was pushback. There was a group of people that said it was time to take back America again. They cheated in an election in 1877 and put a president in place who lost the popular vote but was given the Electoral College, and then began to turn back at the Supreme Court. So it ended with riots and literally insurrections all over the country. Then the second Reconstruction is 1954 to 1968, beginning with the Brown versus Board of Education decision. During that time, we got Medicaid, Medicare. We got the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, fundamental policy shifts to try to address poverty. You got the War on Poverty to address racism. Then it was killed and assassinated. Dr. King was murdered, and so many others. The president was murdered. And then you get the Southern strategy, Richard Nixon, Pat Buchanan telling Richard Nixon, we have to engage in positive polarization at all times to keep poor black and white people away from each other, particularly voting in the South. A third Reconstruction really will be about finishing what didn't finish in the first two. It will be expanding and protecting voting rights. It would be guaranteeing income for those that are disabled, those that are hurting in our society. It would be guaranteeing a a living wage as a minimum wage. It would be guaranteeing basic, decent housing. It would be addressing the mass incarceration and the criminalization of black and brown and poor white communities. It would be addressing what we call systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, the denial of health care, the war economy, where we spend now 54 cents of every discretionary dollar on the war economy and less than 16 cents, Tom, on things that would really lift people up and would be a war on poverty rather than a war on the poor. And a third Reconstruction would also address the false, distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism. We actually have a third Reconstruction platform. You can find it at www.poorpeoplescampaign.org. And lastly, the economists have said that a moral agenda is an economically sound agenda, and that to not engage this is not only morally indefensible, constitutionally inconsistent, politically insensitive, but it's economically insane. It's economically insane to have 87 million people right now either uninsured or underinsured. It's economically insane not to pay essential workers a living wage and make sure we have child income tax credit and earned income tax credit and those things that would actually lift the society and would actually grow the society.
I'd like you to help me with a reality check on my perception of what's been going on here. My recollection, and I was actually quite politically active in the 60s, was that Martin Luther King was as much reaching out to white people as he was also speaking about the horrors of segregation and you know, the whole crisis of black people in the United States at the time. In fact, when he was assassinated, he was trying to organize sanitation workers, many of whom were white. He spoke about this frequently, in addition to speaking loudly against the Vietnam War and U.S. imperialism and other problems. But there's been this kind of Disneyfication of Dr. King, and I see, frankly, I think in some of the anti-critical race theory nonsense that's coming out of the Republican Party, also an attempt to only show that Disneyfied part. So he was actually pushing poor people's issues. You know, yes, race was a piece of this, obviously, but not, you know, at the forefront, at least in the context of the Poor People's March, was like, let's deal with poverty, period. And my understanding is that that's what you're doing too. And yet our media constantly covers you and the work you're doing and the Poor People's Campaign and what Martin Luther King did as if it was purely an issue around black people. It seems like if it was put together, and you have, if it was accurately reported, and this is my reality check, maybe I've got this wrong, if it was accurately reported, you'd be bringing along a lot of white people too.
And we are, in spite of the things that people have done. We had planned to have this mass assembly in 2020. COVID hit. We went online. 2.7 million people showed up. You know, we're as welcome in Eastern Kentucky as we are in the Delta of Mississippi. But here's the reality check. And Dr. King talked about the triune evil. They're not just in 67. He was talking about it in the first sermon, one of the first sermons he preached at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church when he talked about Paul's letter to the American Christian. He talked about how the 1% was ruling over the 99%. But at the period you're speaking of, he said, listen, you got to deal with racism, war, and militarism. We say today you have to deal with systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. Now, on one side, even liberals try to reduce Dr. King down to one issue. I've challenged some quote-unquote African-Americans who do that, say, for instance, voting rights. We said it was Jim Crow. This attack on voting rights today is not Jim Crow. It's James Crow Esquire. The reason it's not just Jim Crow is because if you look at the bills that are being passed, yes, it's going to hurt black people, but it's also going to hurt white people, disabled people, Native Americans, Asians. In fact, I think 55 million people, if the current bills that are out there were passed in every state, would lose the access to the polls they had in 2020. 55 million people, not 55 million black people. Secondly, Dr. King would never have separated voting rights from economic justice. So, for instance, when Joe Manchin voted to block living wages in the American Rescue Plan, civil rights leaders, labor leaders, everybody should have been calling that what it was, a race vote and a class vote. Why race? because one vote blocked 41% of African Americans from lifting out of poverty and low wealth, but it also blocked 31 million Americans from being lifted out of poverty, the majority of which are white, because in this country, of the 140 million poor and low wealth people, 66 million are white, 26 million are black. What we need is a unification. In 1965, the end of the Selma to Montgomery March, Dr. King said that what caused the segregated society and the voter suppression was not just a hatred of people's skin color. It was the fear of the aristocracy, the bourbon class, he called it, of the masses of Negro people and the masses of poor white people coming together, forming a political bloc that would fundamentally shift the economic architecture of the nation. And it started in the first Reconstruction, because the fear in the South was always that coalition, in fact, the fear in the country. And so what we're saying, Tom, you're exactly right, is that there's time for a moral fusion movement and an interrelational movement that addresses these interlocking injustices. You can't separate them out. So if you're white and you're concerned about economics, you have to be concerned about racist voter suppression. If you're concerned about racist voter suppression, you need to understand how it connects to the denial of other progressive policies. And I actually get bothered quite a bit. My co-chair is white. I happen to be African-American. Our movement is about all five of these things we lift. And sometimes, Tom, in the media, they'll say, well, which one is the most important? And I say, all of them, because all of them interrelate. And they'll say, well, you're a civil rights leader. I said, we're moral leaders. We're religious and moral leaders, human rights leaders who are trying to say that the people who make up that 140 million poor and low wealth in this country, it's time for them to come together. Because right now in this country, Tom, last point, we did a study, 15 states, 15 so-called battleground states. If anywhere between 1% and 25% of poor and low wealth people would vote around an agenda, not black people, but poor low wealth, they could fundamentally decide who sits in the presidency.
There you go. There you go. Dr. Barber, we're out of time, but you're absolutely right. It's brilliant. Thank you so much for dropping by today.